What's going on, everyone? So with set 4 quickly approaching and rotation down the line about a year away, I figured we'd dive into some leaders that obviously we could sit here and talk about the best leaders that are obviously going to have some really nice potential in the next set when it comes out because they're already really good. But instead of talking about those, talk about some leaders that maybe are decent already, or leaders that are kind of just under that decent tier that may have a time to shine before they get rotated out. With set 4 coming, either they have some good synergies with the new cards or just really work well against some of those mechanics in set 4. Before we dive into that today, I actually have the very first sponsor for today's video that we've ever done on this channel. Let's talk about BetterHelp. I am happy to be sponsored by BetterHelp for today's video. As many of you know, I had a daughter about 5 months ago. I immediately got rushed with all sorts of expectations for myself as well as for the YouTube channel. As much as I love playing Star Wars Limited and recording videos, it's not always the most productive thing to be doing. Should I be sitting here creating videos or even wasting my time doing anything but something more productive? And any life-changing event can obviously bring about some crazy internal expectations and pressures, and that's where BetterHelp comes in, helping you balance work life, self-care, or even figuring out when those personal expectations are a bit extreme. I mean, come on. We gotta play our Star Wars Unlimited every once in a while, huh? Being able to handle certain family dynamics, whether it's for your children, siblings, or parents. With BetterHelp, you'll be able to fill out a questionnaire to connect with a therapist in just a couple of days from a network of over 30,000 plus licensed professionals fully online. Start fresh with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/veiledshot and get 10% off your first month of therapy. And thank you for sponsoring this video. So starting off the list of leaders that you might want to take a double take on for set 4, we've got Mace Windu. This guy immediately was on my list, especially since over the past couple of weeks, we've seen quite a few Mace Windu blues pop up in the planetary qualifiers and just overall in the meta, just randomly. Right? Not like an insanely popular deck, but just popping up here and there, mainly because Mace Windu Blue has shown itself to be a reasonably solid control deck. I would definitely put it into that B tier range where, because of Mace Windu's action coupled with a lot of these direct damage events, you actually have a lot more removal options than you otherwise would have. Couple that with the fact that he comes down and is like a pseudo Wrath on the backside, you actually do have a pretty interesting leader. Now, he does deploy for 7. He is a 5/8. It's not like he's going to end the game, and I don't think he's going to break necessarily set 4. However, one of the nice things with set 4 is indirect damage, and we've seen a couple of cards that are pretty strong for that mechanic. And I think we could actually move Mace Windu from this like hard control, use your action, use these direct damage events, to more of like this aggressively situated, I'm attacking with my Y-wings or whatnot and getting in this indirect damage and making my opponent rethink how they want to divvy up that damage because of the Mace Windu action, preventing them from really maximizing on their HP pools of their units because Mace Windu will just slowly ping them down. Or because of the indirect damage that we have on some units, coupled with the fact that Mace Windu already wants to have direct damage events, you could actually just build a pretty strong deck that really makes your opponent think. Now, indirect damage is a little bit tricky because I do find that you're going to want to be in a more aggressive deck to take full advantage of it, and Mace Windu, obviously, as we've seen in the past, isn't really that. But if we see a few more powerful indirect damage options or things that deal this massive like array of damage, maybe we could see a little bit more value for Mace Windu. The Mandalorian is one of the leaders that I am most excited about, and I think this one is pretty obvious once we mention the mechanics from set 4 as well as what the Mandalorian's trying to do. So if any of you have played the Mandalorian, he is an interesting deck, because you have to mix these events, or rather these upgrades, with your units. And oftentimes these upgrades, the strong ones at least, require units that are on the ground. But if you're playing all ground units, well, you're going to struggle in space. But you kind of have to play ground units to play the upgrades. But then if you're mixing space units with ground units and upgrades, you really have a lot of deck building constraints, because without the upgrades, you're not getting value to the Mandalorian ability. Without the proper ground units, you can't play the upgrades. And without the space units, you can't combat in space. Lots of things to think about. However, with the new set, we're going to have piloting, allowing you to play essentially upgrades when you want them and subpar units when you don't have them. Add to the fact that those upgrades are exclusively played on vehicles. You now can play this tempo space deck, ideally, with the Mandalorian. Something like potentially cunning aggression, where you have Tarkin Town as well to completely dominate the early game. Imagine something like a Y-Wing, where you're dealing indirect damage that they kind of are forced to take all the damage, which is a lot of damage every single swing, or, you know, get rid of some of their units in the early game with Tarkin Town, and then put a piloting on them, exhausting their preventing their ability to attack, while also pumping more damage to that. I just find that this could have a lot of implications to do some really powerful things. Not to mention, the Mandalorian is in the perfect color combination to take advantage of some of those powerful heroism vehicles in the space. The Millennium Falcon, for example, and the new Millennium Falcon coming, as well as a bunch of really early space units. And we've seen this with my previous Wedge video, where we had the command cunning kind of combination really see some power. This one, on the other hand, can take full advantage of the tempo, exhausting enemy units in the early game by playing a bunch of cheap space units and then piloting them up, and then taking advantage of potentially Tarkin Town and the exhaust to really put your opponent on the back foot, maybe with an all space deck, which is weird because the Mandalorian really can't do that right now, because there's not that many upgrades that you can take advantage of in the current meta that are applied to vehicles. So very interesting with the Mandalorian. And there's a lot of cheap upgrades as well, like R2-D2, for example, which costs 0, which can be really exciting too. Anakin's up next, and this one's interesting because it's probably the most meta viable option on the list. Actually, it's the most meta viable option on the list already. So, I mean, putting this on the list, there's obviously going to be potential for him in the next set. Let's just get that out of the way. But what I found interesting about Anakin specifically is this action just has a lot of options to me. For one, if we're going to see pilots and these decks that are trying to pump up a lot of these really awesome units, suddenly being able to do 2 additional damage to a unit can really mess with opponents' strategies to pump them up with potentially upgrades, right? If you're sitting, let's say, with, well, a space unit, like an A-Wing on turn 1, and your opponent also, let's say, plays an A-Wing, and they have a pilot, they want to go with the bigs, right? They want to apply the bigs to their A-Wing and get in a big swing. Normally, if you just apply the bigs, suddenly that A-Wing won't die to an attack from an opposing A-Wing. But with Anakin, suddenly that A-Wing that you have can kill their A-Wing and live. Well, actually, it can't live because bigs gives +2 power, so take that back. But you're able to kill their A-Wing with just a simple attack. So you can actually 2-for-1 them with just an attack. Not that your opponent would play into that necessarily, but that's the whole point, is that it actually gives you another dynamic with your units. And we've seen this already be extremely powerful, to where if pilots are an impactful unit or an impactful mechanic in the new set, then I can see Anakin's ability doing even more work with it. But that's not just all of it, right? We can also see this really work well with pilots, to the point where now you have pilots and Anakin's ability, you can punch up way above your weight class, which could be really interesting. And with indirect damage potentially in the meta, you could take it all and maybe pump up your Anakin, or, you know, take more damage than you otherwise would have and split some across your units to really pump up Anakin and not die too quickly. So you have a lot of kind of interesting little small things that add up to an already good leader, to where I think there's a lot of potential with Anakin himself with the new set. Speaking of a leader that, well, looks pretty good already and is gonna have some potential in the new set, we gotta talk about Rey. This one's another one that's already pretty nice in the meta. Definitely not like top 5 or anything like that, but still pretty good in her Rey red makeup. But what's really interesting about her is this action has already seen so much application. We have random things like, if you remember in set 2, Moisture Farmer was one of like the best cards in Rey's deck. And for those of you that played Draft, my goodness, was Moisture Farmer just an absolutely absurd card. But this one to give any 2 or less power unit an extra experience token can really change the game. Now, there is going to be more upgrade hate just naturally in the game, which is going to be maybe a downside for these experience tokens, but I don't necessarily think that Rey would be too affected for it, because I think if your opponent's going to be confiscating or actually using cards to defeat these upgrades, it's not really going to be that big of a deal for you. So it has to be some kind of something else that's giving you a little bit of value and defeating an upgrade. So I don't think that's really going to hinder all that much. And what's really a nice bonus is we do have a bunch of things that are doing something else in the game, specifically with the indirect damage cards, as we've spoken about. And they typically have low power because they're giving you something else with it. Being able to put an experience token on those guys is going to be really nuts. And Rey Red already can actually be reasonably aggressive. It is more of a mid-range, leaning towards soft control, with Rey herself having that restore 3 and getting you really into the late game. But honestly, you could do some massive work and pump out some massive damage with Rey Red just by pumping up experience tokens on some early game units. And heck, we even got that other, early 1 resource play that's a 0/4 that can become a 1/5 on turn 1 with Rey that helps you attack with fighters. Like, we could see some sort of like minor fighter synergy where you're pumping up your Y-Wings with experience tokens and some early drops and whatnot. I don't know what the potential is. We obviously haven't seen enough cards to really see a crazy deck out of just set 4, but the bones are really good with Rey already, and there already are a few cards that I'm really excited about to drop into a Rey deck. So I do think this has a lot of potential here. And for the last one on our list, talk about a leader that completely diminishes one of the new mechanics in the next set: Obi-Wan Kenobi. Any deck that's going to be running this preventable or unpreventable indirect damage strategy, Obi-Wan seems to be like the direct counter to it. You're able to divvy up the damage how you like, and more importantly, this healing 1 damage from a unit almost acts as like healing 1 damage from your base, because if your opponent's going with the aggressive indirect damage strategy, you can kind of redirect that to your units constantly, healing them up consistently, which essentially acts as 1 HP to your base. Add that to the fact that your flip side on Obi-Wan is going to be coming down with this Sentinel and then healing damage from one of your units. You're basically always going to get that option in that indirect damage matchup. Now, this is definitely, out of all of the cards or leaders that we've spoken about today, Mandalorian kind of just relies on his own synergies with pilots, right? Which I think is already going to have potential. Mace Windu, again, another one that relies on his own synergy with indirect damage. Anakin and Rey are already pretty good leaders. Anakin just interacting with overall units and mechanics that happen naturally within the set, and Rey interacting with units that are in her own deck. Obi-Wan will only really see a rise in potential if indirect damage is something that is meta. Now, I have played a lot of the new Boba Fett, and I do think it has potential, which is why Obi-Wan's on this list, but it will be a symptom of the meta rather than Obi-Wan, I think, being an insane leader in of himself. And we've seen this already with set 3, where cards like Cad Bane and Tarkin Town in general, Obi-Wan can kind of mitigate some of that a little bit, which can be pretty nice and give you an interesting way to play the game in the early game where a lot of other decks can't play that way. So I think there is some potential there with Obi-Wan, but one of those leaders that will be very symptomatic rather than I guess you could say, proactive in improving themselves. But that's going to wrap up the top 5 leaders that have some potential for the new set. And I want to say another big thank you to BetterHelp, guys. I absolutely love making videos for you all. And, well, if I can make more videos and dedicate just a little bit more time to it, because we're able to get sponsors like BetterHelp that are actually worth putting on a video, then I'm even more happy about that, right? So definitely give it a check in the link down below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.